There's a hill in southeastern Turkey that has quietly broken every rule archaeologists spent a century writing. Not one rule, not a few. Every single foundational assumption about when human civilization began, who was capable of building what, and what the word primitive actually means when applied to our ancestors. This hill has been doing that since the day a Kurdish shepherd noticed a stone sticking out of the dry ground in 1994 and mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else. And for 30 years, researchers have been pulling carefully at the threads this hill is made of, writing careful papers, defending careful positions, and living inside the careful limits of what their disciplines allowed them to say. Then someone asked Grok, the artificial intelligence developed by Elon Musk's XAI, to look at everything at once, to hold 30 years of laser scans, ground-penetrating radar surveys, soil analysis, astronomical data, symbol catalogs, and excavation records in its attention simultaneously, with no theory to protect and no career to lose, and simply report what it found. What came back did not start an argument. It produced a silence, the kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone in it realizes at the same moment that the story they had been telling was missing its most important chapter. That hill is called Göbekli Tepe. In the local Kurdish language, the name means belly button of the earth, or more evocatively, the hill of the navel. It sits about 12 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa in the far southeast of Turkey, close to the Syrian border. The ground up here is pale, cracked, and dry. Limestone pushes through the thin soil in places. Goats graze on whatever sparse vegetation manages to grow. From a distance, this ridge looks entirely unremarkable, and that is exactly why it spent most of the 20th century unnoticed. A survey team that passed through in the 1960s noticed broken limestone slabs poking through the dirt, concluded they were probably fragments of a medieval graveyard, made a note of it, and moved on. The most important archaeological site on the surface of the earth was dismissed as a footnote in a survey report and left alone for the next 30 years. And under the ground, sealed in deliberate silence, the stones waited. What those stones turn out to be is this: a complex of at least 20 circular stone enclosures, and geophysical surveys strongly suggest many more still buried and unexcavated, each one built from massive T-shaped limestone monoliths standing in rings. The largest pillars reach approximately 18 feet in height. They weigh an estimated 50 tons each. Not rough boulders dragged into position, shaped stones, ground and cut into a deliberate form, wider across the top, creating the crossbar of a letter T, and bearing on their surfaces a catalog of animals carved in shallow and deep relief with a steady, confident hand. Foxes, lions, vultures with wings stretched wide, scorpions, snakes flowing in coiled bundles, wild boar, cranes, and geometric shapes and abstract symbols that repeat across enclosure after enclosure with a consistency that art does not produce on its own. On the central pillars of each circle, if you look carefully, you find something that reframes everything else. Arms, carved along the sides of the pillar, bending at the elbow, ending in long-fingered hands that rest at the front. Below them, the suggestion of a belt, a garment. These T-shaped megaliths are not abstract markers. They are figures, bodies. Something is standing at the center of each enclosure, faceless, enormous, its arms folded across itself, watching. The radiocarbon dates that came back from the earliest layers of this site changed the world of archaeology quietly and permanently. Göbekli Tepe was first built approximately 11,600 years ago. Sit with that number. It is easy to say and almost impossible to feel. 11,600 years. That is roughly 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was constructed, more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge. At the moment these pillars were raised, the last ice age had only recently loosened its grip on the planet. Woolly mammoths still walked parts of the northern world. And the people who are supposed to have built this, according to the academic consensus of the time, were scattered bands of hunter-gatherers with no metal, no wheel, no writing, no domesticated animals, no agriculture, and no architectural tradition of any kind, because Göbekli Tepe has no predecessors. There's nothing in the archaeological record that leads up to it. It appears, as researchers have noted with increasing discomfort over the years, almost fully formed out of a world that had built nothing remotely resembling it. Klaus Schmidt was the German archaeologist who heard about the shepherd's discovery and could not let it rest. He had spent years studying the prehistory of this region. He knew what a worked stone looked like against a natural one. When he climbed that ridge and saw the shapes emerging from the dirt, he understood immediately that the 1960s survey had made a catastrophically wrong call. Systematic excavation began in 1995 and would consume the rest of his life. He worked this hill for nearly 2 decades. He died in 2014, still trying to fully understand what he had uncovered. The dig continued after him, led by excavation director Professor Necmi Karul, and the discoveries have not slowed down. If anything, each new season adds a layer of complexity that the season before had not anticipated. What makes the physical problem of Göbekli Tepe so difficult to set aside is that it does not exist in isolation. In November 2025, Turkey's Ministry of Culture announced the discovery of approximately 30 new Neolithic artifacts from across the Şanlıurfa region, including a statue with a facial expression that excavators described as reminiscent of a deceased individual, a unique find in terms of what it reveals about death rituals and symbolic expression among people who had not yet invented writing. The ministry's Taş Tepeler project, incorporating 12 Neolithic sites across the province, now attracts around 800,000 visitors to Göbekli Tepe annually. The site was expected to draw that many in 2025 alone. The world has recognized that something profound is here. The argument is about what? The conventional explanation for the site has been taught in universities and printed in guidebooks for decades, and it deserves to be stated clearly and fairly because it is not without logic. According to the mainstream account, bands of hunter-gatherers living in the fertile arc of southeastern Anatolia began gathering at this ridge around 9,600 BCE, drawn by some shared spiritual impulse larger than the daily business of the hunt. They quarried limestone from the bedrock shelf nearby, using tools of stone, bone, and antler, pecking away at the rock grain by grain over weeks and months. They shaped the great T-pillars with hand-held hammerstones. They dragged the finished monoliths to position on ropes and wooden sledges, hundreds of people hauling together, and then levered them upright into sockets cut into the bedrock floor. They arranged them in circles, they carved the animals, and then, at some point around 8,000 BCE, for reasons no one can fully explain, they did something stranger than building it. They buried it. They carried in enormous quantities of rubble, broken stone, animal bone, and soil, and they packed it deliberately around and over the pillars until the entire complex was sealed beneath an artificial mound. In this telling, Göbekli Tepe is the birthplace of religion. The moment human beings first built something for the purpose of worship before they built anything for shelter or storage, a temple before the town, a shrine before the farm. And the very act of gathering to raise it, this theory proposes, is what pushed scattered bands toward agriculture, toward permanence, toward everything that would follow. It is a story that flatters human development. It gives us a clean origin point. And for years, it was the only story that fit inside what scholars were willing to believe about the cognitive and technical capacity of people who had not yet invented the wheel. But there is a problem at the center of this explanation that does not soften the more closely you look at it. Consider the physical reality of what is being claimed. Moving a 50-ton limestone monolith is not a task that disappears just because you assign it to enough people pulling on ropes. Modern engineering teams with hydraulic cranes, steel cables rated to specific loads, diesel machinery, and digital planning tools treat the movement of 50-ton objects as a serious operation with real margins for catastrophic failure. When experimental archaeologists have tried to recreate the ancient methods, using wooden rollers, woven fiber ropes, earthen ramps, and teams of dozens of volunteers, they have managed with enormous effort to move much smaller stones across level ground. Scaling that to 50 tons, up a ridge, and then setting the stone precisely upright in a pre-cut socket is another challenge entirely. And in the unfinished quarry areas surrounding the site, there are pillars still lying in the bedrock that were never freed. Some of them are estimated at close to 7 meters and well above 50 tons. Someone was actively preparing to move those. And then there's the question of finish. The surfaces of the well-preserved pillars at Göbekli Tepe are flat in a way that a pecked, hand-hammered stone surface should not be. People who have been permitted to touch them describe running their hand along the face of a pillar and feeling something unexpected. Genuine flatness, sides that are true, edges that turn at deliberate angles, a geometric tolerance that researchers have measured at roughly 2 to 3% across monoliths weighing as much as 50 tons. The animal reliefs are cut with a confidence that does not belong to people inventing sculpture for the first time. It is the work of a tradition, of hands that have done this many times before, that have inherited a way of working stone from people who knew it before them. And that single observation opens a question the standard explanation genuinely cannot hold. If Göbekli Tepe is the beginning, where is the clumsy early version? Where are the rough first attempts, the fumbling apprenticeship work, the crude transitional pieces that should logically precede mastery of this scale? The answer, which archaeologists have noted in careful language for years without being able to resolve it, is that the earliest, deepest, oldest circles at the site are not the roughest. They are the finest. The best work is at the bottom of the sequence. That single fact, the best at the bottom, is the thread that Grok pulled when it finally looked at everything at once. In September 2025, Turkish archaeologists announced the discovery of a human statue embedded directly into the wall between two of the main enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, not found standing on a floor, not buried in a pit. Built into the fabric of the structure itself, horizontally, its head and torso preserved, integrated into the architecture the way a load-bearing element is integrated, as though the wall carried memory and identity as well as weight. This discovery, combined with the ongoing excavations at the nearby sister site of Karahan Tepe, where a 135-centimeter tall pillar bearing the first explicitly carved human face ever found in this cultural network was unearthed, has accelerated the recognition that Göbekli Tepe was never a simple ceremonial clearing. The Turkish Ministry of Culture's Taş Tepeler project, meaning stone hills, now encompasses 12 Neolithic sites across the Şanlıurfa region, all sharing architectural conventions, symbolic vocabularies, and construction techniques that point to a coordinated cultural network operating across a vast area over thousands of years. The logistics of maintaining that network, the quarrying, the transport, the shared symbolic tradition held consistent across 15 centuries and dozens of sites imply an institutional memory and organizational capacity that most historians associate with something far more structured than wandering bands of hunters. This is the landscape Grok encountered when researchers fed it 3 decades of accumulated data without a hypothesis to test and without any instruction about what it was supposed to find. The system began where any honest analysis begins, with the symbols. For 30 years, the carved animals and geometric marks at Göbekli Tepe had been described as ritual art, meaningful certainly. But the meaning was assumed to be spiritual and expressive, the kind of meaning a painting carries, rather than the kind a text carries. Grok did not approach the symbols as art. It counted. It cataloged every carved mark across every pillar and every enclosure, measured their distribution, their frequency, their position relative to each other, and looked for the mathematical structure underneath the visual surface. What it found did not behave the way art behaves. Art is expressive. It repeats motifs, but loosely, emotionally, without hard rule. What the analysis detected in the Göbekli Tepe symbols was constraint. Certain forms appeared only in certain positions. Some symbols never appeared adjacent to each other. Others clustered with a regularity that no expressive or decorative impulse alone produces. The system identified what computational linguists call conditional distribution, the statistical fingerprint that separates a language from a mural, the signature of a system obeying rules. In plain terms, the placement of one symbol was governing the placement of the next. There was grammar in the stone, a structure built not to express feeling but to carry information reliably across time, from people who appear to have understood that time was the enemy they were racing. A University of Edinburgh researcher named Dr. Martin Sweatman had published a landmark paper in 2024 in the journal Time and Mind, presenting an astronomical interpretation of the symbols at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. His analysis of the V-shaped carvings on certain pillars found that each V could represent a single day, and that the sequence of these marks on one pillar could be read as a solar calendar of 365 days, consisting of 12 lunar months plus 11 additional days. The placement of structural pillars aligns with the sunrise and sunset during the equinoxes. The animal figures, when mapped against astronomical records, correlate with constellations visible from this exact location, at this exact latitude across specific historical periods. Grok took this astronomical thread and followed it further than any single human researcher could, reconstructing the precise positions of the stars and constellations visible over southeastern Turkey 11,600 years ago, accounting for the slow wobble of the Earth's axis across millennia, known as precession, which shifts the position of the constellations across thousands of years. When it overlaid the carved animal figures against that reconstructed ancient sky, the shapes stopped being animals and started being maps. The vulture, the scorpion, the bull, the serpent, figure after figure, matched the star patterns occupying those same regions of the sky in that era, not loosely and poetically, but positionally, with a specificity of people who had spent generations watching the heavens and understood their movements deeply enough to freeze one precise arrangement of them in stone forever. And the sky they recorded was not an ordinary night. Cross-referenced against geological core samples and ice records, the astronomical configuration captured in the carvings correlates with a specific and catastrophic window in time. Roughly 12,900 years ago, as the planet was warming out of the last ice age, temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped suddenly and severely, plunging back into deep cold in what scientists call the Younger Dryas event. Within a human lifetime, perhaps far less, temperatures may have fallen as much as 10 degrees in some regions. The cause remains debated, but a growing body of geological and physical evidence points toward a cosmic impact event, the fragments of a comet or similar body striking the Earth, igniting widespread fires across continents and throwing sufficient debris into the atmosphere to dramatically reduce sunlight and trigger a rapid return to near glacial conditions. The builders of Göbekli Tepe carved the sky of that catastrophe into their stones, not as decoration, not as myth, as a record with a precision and an astronomical understanding that researchers looking at the aligned evidence have described as far in advance of what the textbooks assign to people of that era. What Grok then found in the enclosures, when it measured their precision and sorted them by age, is the detail that turns the standard account completely inside out. If the builders had been learning and improving over centuries, as every developing society does, the oldest enclosures would be the crudest and the newest the finest. That is the shape of knowledge growing. The data showed the exact opposite. The earliest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are the most astronomically precise, deviating from their intended alignments by an average of less than half a degree, which is extraordinary for any structure built without modern instruments. The later enclosures drift. The pillars grow smaller. The carvings become simpler and more hesitant. The grammatical structure of the symbols begins to break down, as though the people carving them understood less and less of the language they were reproducing with each passing generation. This was not a civilization developing its knowledge. It was a civilization losing it. They inherited a body of understanding they had not created, and each generation passed on a slightly diminished version to the next, the way a manuscript copied by someone who cannot read the original language preserves the shapes of the letters even as the meaning fades. And at the same time, the knowledge was fading. They were carving faster, building more urgently, packing the records into stone as though they knew the window was closing. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped construction phases buried beneath the enclosures we can currently see. Older structures sharing the same symbolic grammar, the same sky charts, the same architectural logic, potentially pushing the origin point of this tradition back toward 12,000 BCE or earlier, deeper than any excavation has yet reached, older than the story was already willing to go. And Grok connected Göbekli Tepe to the network of 12 surrounding sites, sharing its symbols, its techniques, and its deliberate burial pattern, all of them sealed in the same engineered way, not abandoned but archived. The fill chosen specifically to protect the carved surfaces, to keep the message readable for whoever might one day uncover it and possess the tools to finally understand what it said. There's an engineering detail that deserves its own moment of attention before we arrive at the conclusion, because it is the kind of detail that stops engineers, rather than historians, cold. The stone-filled sections between the pillars at Göbekli Tepe are not random rubble. Analysis of the structural arrangement shows that the pillars were set with deliberate gaps, and the fill was layered and chosen in a way that allows the structure to flex slightly during seismic events, rather than transmitting the shock rigidly and shattering. This is called seismic isolation, and it is a principle that sits in modern structural engineering textbooks as an advanced technique for building resilient structures in earthquake-prone regions. It was implemented on this ridge by people who had no written mathematics, no engineering tradition, and no precedent to learn it from. Either they discovered this principle empirically through generations of observation and failure, which would itself require an organized architectural tradition far older than anything in the record, or they came to this hill already knowing it. Neither option fits comfortably inside the standard account. What the machine concluded, stated in the terms it used, was that Göbekli Tepe is not a temple in the conventional sense. It is a library, not a building for worshipping something, but a building for preserving something, specifically the memory of a catastrophe that had nearly ended the world and the astronomical knowledge needed to recognize the conditions that preceded it. The buried complex is not an abandoned sacred site. It is an archive that was deliberately sealed for preservation. And the warning it contains, encoded in the grammar of carved symbols, recorded in the positions of the constellations as they appeared on a specific terrible night, is not a message about the past. It is a message about a pattern. The thing that came from the sky and nearly ended everything once, the physics of the solar system have not removed from the range of possibility. The 2026 Berlin exhibition at the James Simon Gallery, running until the end of July and featuring 96 artifacts from the Schönlurfa Museum, drew visitors from across the world to engage with objects from this network of sites that are quietly forcing an entire discipline to ask a question it has been reluctant to ask. Not who built Göbekli Tepe in the sense of which tribe, which culture, which community of hunter-gatherers, but what kind of knowledge is encoded in its stones? Where did that knowledge come from? And what were the people who created it trying to make sure we did not forget? The machine looked at all of it without bias and gave its answer. The answer has not yet been refuted. It has been met, as such answers often are when they are inconvenient enough, with silence, and on the ridge above Schönlurfa, sealed under soil and studied and slowly understood, the stones continue their long wait for the rest of us to catch up to what they have been saying all along. The most revealing detail of everything Grok reported is also the simplest. When an artificial intelligence with no academic allegiances and no professional constraints looked at the totality of the data from Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding Taş Tepeler network, the question it found most important was not who built it. That question, which has consumed 30 years of debate, turns out to be the less interesting one. The more important question, the one the AI kept returning to in different formulations from different angles, was what happened before it. The best work is at the bottom. The most precise astronomical alignments are in the oldest layers. The richest and most grammatically complex symbolic encoding is in the earliest enclosures. This is not what a beginning looks like. Every beginning in the human record that we can observe shows the opposite pattern. The first pottery is crude. The first writing is simple. The first architecture is small and tentative. Beginnings are clumsy. Göbekli Tepe is not clumsy. It is not tentative. It is not simple. The earliest layers are the best layers, and if the best is at the beginning, then what we are looking at is not a beginning at all. It is an inheritance, a transmission, a desperate, stone-encoded attempt by people who had received something extraordinary from people before them to pass that same something forward through the only medium strong enough to survive what they apparently knew was coming. Stone, arranged into libraries, sealed, and left for whoever would come after, in whatever world would exist on the other side of the silence, with the tools to finally read what had been written there. The question left open at the end of Grok's analysis, the one that will drive the next generation of excavations deeper into that ridge and across the other 11 sites of the Taş-Tepeler network, is not a comfortable one. If this is an inheritance, who was the source? And if the warning carved into Pillar 43 is what the astronomical analysis says it is, a precise record of the day a cosmic catastrophe struck a world that had built something worth warning the future about, then the question sitting quietly underneath all of it is one that physics, rather than archaeology, is best equipped to answer. The pattern that produced the Younger Dryas, the orbital dynamics, and the debris fields of the solar system have not been permanently cleared from the path of this planet. The warning was not written for the past. It was written for whoever would eventually develop the machines capable of reading it. That may turn out to be us, right now. Which is perhaps why the silence that fell over the room when Grok's report came back was the kind that takes a long time to lift.